in the band, and Robert, of course. It's always a surprise one after the other with Robert. So it's not dull. You can spend the rest of the year doing anything else.
There was a time when you couldn't walk through a grocery store, turn on the car radio, or browse a music blog without hearing her name or her voice. That unmistakable, delicate tone that seemed to float just above the air. Alison Krauss wasn't just a singer. She was a phenomenon, angelic, untouchable. She had the kind of voice that didn't just sing, it lingered. It wrapped around you like memory, ethereal, haunting, impossibly pure. When Alison Krauss opened her mouth, it felt like time paused. With 26 Grammy Awards to her name, more than Beyoncé had at the time, more than Aretha, more than any other female artist in history, she stood on the tallest peaks of American music. From the Grand Ole Opry to global arenas, she was the soft-spoken powerhouse behind an entire revival of bluegrass. Her collaborations with artists like Robert Plant blurred genres and redefined what country and Americana could be. She had it all: respect, acclaim, timelessness. And then she vanished. No farewell tour, no dramatic exit, no social media post explaining why. One day, the most recognizable voice in modern country music simply went quiet. Why would the golden girl of bluegrass, the woman who turned sorrow into symphony, walk away? What truly happened to Alison Krauss? To understand why Alison Krauss vanished, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Not to her first Grammy, not even to her first record. You have to go back to the quiet, unassuming girl from Champaign, Illinois, who picked up a fiddle before most kids learned to read. At just 5 years old, she began winning fiddle competitions. By 12, she was performing live. At 14, she released her debut album, Too Late to Cry. That's not just young, it's unheard of in the world of traditional music. And she wasn't just good, she was miles ahead of anyone her age. Alison wasn't a celebrity in the making. She was a phenomenon. And in a genre like bluegrass, deeply rooted, often male-dominated, and stubbornly traditional, her arrival wasn't just refreshing, it was revolutionary. But genius has its price. With every flawless note, every accolade came something invisible: expectation. She didn't just become a star, she became a symbol, a standard, a myth. Audiences didn't just want music from her, they wanted magic, effortless brilliance. By the time she was in her 20s, Alison Krauss wasn't just representing a genre. She was carrying it, and that weight slowly started to crush her. The music industry can be brutal in its praise. When someone like Alison arrives, there's a hunger to define her, brand her, own her story. Her image became synonymous with purity, control, and vulnerability, wrapped up in a soft voice and sweet smile. But behind that image was a young woman fighting to breathe. Perfection became not just a goal, but a cage. She was adored, yes, but that adoration came with a silent condition: never fall apart in public, never show weakness, never miss a note. But what happens when your greatest gift becomes your greatest pressure? What happens when the world loves you for the one part of yourself you no longer control? That's when the cracks start forming. The weight of perfection. Behind every graceful note was a woman unraveling, quietly, privately, and far away from the thunderous applause that once lifted her. People saw the elegance, the stillness, the voice that never cracked. They didn't see the exhaustion pooling behind her eyes, or the way she'd grip a cup of tea backstage just to stop her hands from shaking. Touring sounds glamorous until you live it. For Alison, it became a cycle of airports, hotel rooms, rehearsals, interviews, stages, and then the same thing all over again. A life measured in miles instead of moments. She once joked that she didn't unpack suitcases anymore. She just lived out of them. The humor was real. The exhaustion behind it was even more real. Her perfectionism, The very trait that made her legendary started turning against her. It whispered in the quiet moments, "Do better, sing better, be better." Not for the fans, she loved them deeply, but for an imaginary judge she carried inside herself. Every missed note, no matter how imperceptible to others, felt like a personal betrayal. Every show became not a celebration, but a test she couldn't afford to fail. And that kind of pressure doesn't come from critics, it comes from within. Friends noticed long before she said anything. She became softer, quieter, almost cautious with her words, as if any misstep in conversation might echo into her music. Even her laughter changed. It didn't ring the way it used to. It faded quickly, like she was saving her energy for something else. Her music changed, too. Not in quality. Alison Krauss couldn't produce a bad performance if she tried. But in tone, there was a subtle melancholy threading through her vocals, a homesickness for a life she wasn't living. Fans described it as soulful or more emotional, not knowing those emotions were real. They were the sound of a woman stretched thin. Have you ever loved something so deeply that it eventually began to drown you? That's where Alison found herself. The stage was her home, but it was also becoming her prison. Applause, once a comfort, now felt overwhelming, like standing too close to a fire. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, silence began to feel safer than the spotlight. Peaceful, even. When the voice breaks. At the peak of her fame, when Alison Krauss stood untouchable and seemingly invincible, the cracks began to form. Slowly at first, so quietly that even she dismissed them, a little fatigue after a show, a strange tightness in her neck, headaches that seemed to come from nowhere. Small things, easy to wave away when audiences were still cheering and the music still flowed. But then, suddenly, everything changed. The notes she once lifted effortlessly, those angelic tones she'd been praised for her entire life, started slipping. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but she noticed. And for someone whose entire identity was built on precision, on purity, that small shift felt catastrophic. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Doctors examined her, tested her, scanned her, and finally, the answer came: dysphonia, a neurological disorder that disrupts the muscles responsible for speech and singing. For most people, it's a nuisance. For a singer of Alison's caliber, it's a nightmare, a thief that steals the very currency of her existence. Imagine having the world's most treasured instrument, and one day realizing it no longer listens to you. Dysphonia doesn't just affect vocal cords, it affects confidence, career, and identity. It introduces doubt into every breath, every syllable, every note. And the cruel irony: the harder you try to control it, the worse it gets. There was only one treatment doctors could offer her, a prescription more painful than any diagnosis: silence. Not rest, not reduced touring. Silence. For someone whose life was built on singing, being told, "You can keep your voice, but only if you stop using it," is devastating. It's like telling an athlete they can keep their legs only if they never run again. And in that moment, Alison Krauss faced the unthinkable. She had to choose between her career and her voice. The night it all collapsed. It was supposed to be routine. Another night, another packed theater, another audience holding its breath for that unmistakable, crystalline voice. The lights rose, the room buzzed with anticipation, and Alison stepped onto the stage with the same quiet confidence she'd carried for decades. She had done this thousands of times. Muscle memory, second nature, almost sacred. But that night, something felt different. A tightness in her throat, a strange heaviness in her chest. She brushed it off. professionals push through. And Alison Krauss was nothing if not professional. The band began. The first notes floated through the hall like warm light. She lifted the microphone. The audience leaned forward, ready for the magic they knew so well. And then, it didn't come. Her voice cracked, not softly, not subtly, but sharply, like a string snapping. She tried again, reaching for a note she had landed effortlessly since childhood. Nothing, just air and strain. A sound so foreign to her that even she didn't recognize it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alison stepped back from the mic, eyes wide, as if her own body had betrayed her in real time. That shock, raw, paralyzing, was worse than any physical pain. She wasn't hurt. She was terrified. Backstage, she collapsed into a chair, trembling. Not because her throat hurt, but because her world had shifted in a single moment. She said later, "I felt trapped in my own body." For someone whose entire identity had been built around precision, control, and an instrument that had never once failed her, this moment was shattering. The audience never knew the truth. They assumed sound issues, fatigue, maybe emotion. But Alison knew better. Something inside her had crossed a line, a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. And in that quiet backstage corner, surrounded by cables and equipment and the muffled chatter of a confused audience, she understood with chilling clarity. Her voice wasn't just faltering, it was slipping away. And nothing in her life would ever be the same after that night. The war no one saw. The following months were filled with absence. No concerts, no surprise appearances, no soft-spoken interviews where she'd smile shyly and avoid taking credit for her own brilliance, just silence. And while fans wondered what had happened, behind closed doors, Alison Krauss was fighting a different kind of battle, one no audience could witness and no critic could review. It wasn't a war of notes or technique anymore. It was a war of identity. For someone who had spent her entire life being defined by her voice, the question hit harder than any diagnosis. Who was she if she couldn't sing? Every attempt to vocalize, even a hum, even a whisper, felt like touching a bruise she didn't know how to heal. It wasn't just that the notes came out wrong, it was that hearing them hurt her spirit more than her throat. The voice she had trusted since childhood now betrayed her at every turn, so she stopped trying. And in that stillness, a new truth emerged. This wasn't physical recovery anymore. It was psychological survival. The real struggle wasn't learning to sing again. It was learning to want to. Because how do you return to the very thing that broke your heart? That was the war no one saw. Outside, the world moved on. Award shows kept airing. New voices took the spotlight. Country and Americana shifted toward slicker, louder, more commercial sounds. But behind the scenes, Alison Krauss existed in a world of repetition and silence. Every day became a quiet ritual of repair. She spent hours working through vocal therapy exercises that most singers would never need to do once repeating isolated syllables, holding tones for precise lengths of time, mapping her breath, reprogramming the connection between her brain and her body, rebuilding a voice from scratch, like a pianist trying to relearn each finger. But the hardest part wasn't physical, it was internal. Her perfectionism, once a source of greatness, turned against her. It became a voice of its own, cold, cutting, constant. You're not ready. You'll never sound the same. You're fading. They've forgotten you. That voice became the one she heard, louder than any melody. Meanwhile, the media began crafting its own story. Whispers of creative tension with bandmates, rumors of reclusive behavior, speculation about her health, her relationships, her relevance. Everyone had a theory. None had the truth. Because the truth wasn't simple. The truth was layered. It was physical pain. Yes, emotional collapse, absolutely fear, doubt, exhaustion, all of it. And still, none of it told the whole story. The private pain no fan saw coming. And then came the heartbreak no fan expected. While the world focused on her voice, her awards, and her absence from the stage, there was another part of Alison Krauss's life quietly unraveling. Far away from the lights and lenses, her identity as a mother, a daughter, a friend, had slowly faded behind the curtain of her career. She has a son, Sam, born in 1999, a child who never asked for the weight of his mother's fame, but who carried its consequences anyway. Alison's relentless touring schedule, once a symbol of dedication, became a source of quiet regret. Missed birthdays turned into missed milestones. The moments that make up a childhood slipped by while she was backstage, in rehearsal, or chasing down the next performance. It wasn't just exhaustion that pulled her into silence, it was the realization that somewhere along the way, the music had overtaken everything else. The person behind the songs, the woman, the mother, the human being, had been left behind. Friends noticed the change. Texts went unanswered. Calls came less frequently. Not out of rudeness, but out of emotional depletion. Fame doesn't just isolate you, it insulates you. And over time, the people closest to her became blurry silhouettes in the background of her public success. The silence, then, wasn't just about vocal rest, it was about finally listening to her son, to her neglected relationships, to her own inner voice that had been drowned out by applause for years. Because what happens when the spotlight is so bright? You can't even see your own reflection anymore? That's when you have to step away, or risk disappearing completely. The years of quiet. Those years off stage weren't just absence. They weren't a pause or a break or a retreat. They were something much harder to define, and even harder to live through. They were transformation. Alison didn't simply wait for her voice to return. She went to war for it. She began working with specialized vocal coaches, learning how to retrain not just her voice, but the connection between body and brain. She entered therapy, confronting the emotional weight she'd carried in silence for years. And she consulted trauma specialists, finally giving language to the things she had always pushed down in the name of performance. And slowly, so slowly it would have gone unnoticed to anyone else, the noise inside her began to settle. The fear, the pressure, the relentless inner voice that told her she'd only ever be enough if she was flawless. But as the fog cleared, a new question emerged, one she hadn't expected. Was anyone still listening? The industry had changed. Audiences moved on quickly. Would they still want her? Or worse, would they only want the version of her that no longer existed? That uncertainty lingered like an echo. As the years quietly rolled on, the world she once ruled began to shift beneath her feet. Union Station, the band that had stood beside her for decades, continued in fragments. Some members explored solo work, others shifted behind the scenes. The cohesive unit that once felt like home began to stretch thin, not out of conflict, but out of time. The pressure for Alison to return was ever present. Fans begged for new albums, festival organizers sent offers, and industry insiders speculated when her comeback would finally happen. But she stayed still, deliberately still. Because while the music world grew louder, faster, more algorithm-driven, Alison was no longer interested in competing for attention. She watched as streams replaced stages, and social media metrics began defining success. but none of it called to her. For the first time in decades, she wasn't trying to prove anything. She had found something far rarer than fame: peace. The real reason she quit. When Alison Krauss finally broke her silence, what she shared wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't wrapped in scandal. It was quieter than people expected, and far more human. Yes, it had to do with her voice. Yes, there were health issues, and yes, she physically couldn't perform the way she once did. But if you stopped there, you'd be missing the heart of her story. Because what truly pulled her off stage wasn't her vocal cords. It was the cost of staying. In an interview years later, she reflected, "I realized I was singing for everyone but myself." That confession hit harder than any headline, because it wasn't just about music. It was about identity, about realizing that every note, every show, every standing ovation had slowly chipped away at her sense of self until there was nothing left to give. She wasn't leaving the spotlight out of weakness. She was escaping a system that had conditioned her to believe she had to earn her worth over and over again. Walking away wasn't failure. It was clarity. Her decision wasn't made in one moment. It came slowly, painfully, over years of silence and self-reflection. And when she finally made it, it wasn't with anger or regret. It was with peace. When Alison Krauss finally returned, it wasn't a grand re-entry. There was no media blitz, no tearful interviews, no dramatic reclaiming of the spotlight. Because she wasn't coming back to reclaim a throne, she was coming back to reclaim herself. Her collaboration with Robert Plant, a pairing that puzzled the industry at first, turned out to be something quietly revolutionary. Two legends from entirely different musical worlds, meeting not for commercial gain, but for the love of sound. No flashy production, no polished pop packaging, just two voices, weathered by time, wrapped around songs with soul. It wasn't a comeback, it was a rebirth. Alison played fewer shows. She didn't apologize for needing space. She set boundaries, something she'd never done before. And gradually, something beautiful happened. The voice came back. Not exactly as it was, but in a way that felt even more authentic. Not flawless, but fearless. Not polished, but profound. It no longer needed to prove anything. Because now, Alison Krauss was no longer performing to be perfect. She was performing to feel whole.